Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing important international questions with a major security analyst. And our guest on the Bugajski hot seat is Edward Joseph, Executive Director of the Institute of World Affairs in Washington. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled European Union Needs to Expand. Facing an existential crisis, the European Union needs to demonstrate its importance by reviving its core mission of including new qualified states as members, instead of wasting time and resources on trying to develop a separate defense structure that would compete with NATO itself. The EU should stick to what it knows best, developing a common economic, legal and social space that includes the entire West Balkan region. A good place to start the new revived enlargement process is with Montenegro, with a population equal to a mid-sized West European city. Its accession formally began in June 2012 and can be accelerated through a commitment by EU leaders to incorporate a new state by the end of this decade or soon thereafter. One could call it the EU's 2020 vision. There are 6 compelling arguments for accelerated accession that would enhance local and regional stability. First, it would help energize political and economic reforms in all states aspiring to EU entry and discourage the dangers of backtracking. Politicians would understand that membership can be secured if reforms are speeded up, and the public will feel less anxious about their economic prospects. Second, Montenegro's entry would undermine nationalist and populist alternatives to the EU project. Destructive domestic and international actors rely on uncertainty, fear and anger to stir conflict and chaos in countries left outside the European Union. Third, Montenegro's EU entry would deter Russian aggression and other forms of international subversion. The EU must demonstrate its resolve and not be intimidated by the Kremlin, which ultimately seeks to fracture the Union, not to expand it. Fourth, the incorporation of new states would revive the EU's core mandate of a united and prosperous Europe. The inclusion of a small state like Montenegro would not be costly in terms of structural assistance, but the benefits to economic development and international investment would prove significant. Fifth, the commitment to enlargement would demonstrate the leadership of key states such as Germany and France, regardless of Britain's exit from the Union. Leaders with new popular mandates must not shirk from a historical challenge, but take bold steps to build a united Europe. And sixth, the Union's revival would underscore that it is not only a partner for NATO and the US, but also a regional stabilizer in its own right. This would also raise the EU's stature in Washington and help strengthen transatlantic bonds. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with our special guest, Edward Joseph, who is the Executive Director of the Institute of World Affairs in Washington. Welcome to the show, Ed.
Thank you very much, Janusz. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for joining me here at the VOA studios in Washington. I'm sure people in Kosovo who are going to be watching are very familiar with you. You work in Kosovo in the past, which we'll come to in a few moments. But let's begin with your organization. Can you tell us about the Institute? In other words, the mission, the staff, the members, the activities. What is it that you do in Washington?
Sure. Our mission began in 1925, actually with the Versailles Peace Conference. President Woodrow Wilson, a figure familiar and revered, Janusz, no doubt by many of your viewers. He took his close friend Charles Crane with him to the Versailles Peace Conference. Both of them, dismayed by the secret French and British diplomacy that led to the borders of the Middle East that we still have, inclined Crane to come back and put his family fortune towards creating a cadre of Americans who understood the world very well. So for 92 years, ICWA, the Institute of Current World Affairs, has been sending highly promising young Americans overseas on 2-year fellowships. We also organize events in Washington as well, some of which we've done in conjunction with Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And I am proud to say I'm both an alumnus and also a lecturer on the faculty of SICE, what we call SICE, Johns Hopkins SICE. And I remain very active in that organization there, and which remains one of the few that is very focused still to this day on developments in the Balkans.
And you issue reports, you hold conferences, presumably you do briefings for government figures and so forth.
SICE in particular, the Center for Transatlantic Relations, where I am a senior fellow and have been for a number of years, headed by Dan Hamilton. It remains one of the most active regions, both in terms of issuing reports, holding events, briefing officials, hosting officials. For example, officials from countries of the Balkans, including Kosovo.
Prime ministers and
absolutely.
And so, yeah.
So SICE remains quite active on the region and has played a critical role in keeping both policymakers here in Washington and embassies and the public informed about the developments in the region.
Very good. You personally, Ed, have had a lot of experience in the Balkans. We go back many years, decades one would say, but you've had a lot of experience in the region. Can you sort of give us an overview where you have worked both for U.S. government and outside of government in the region?
I can, happy to do that, Janusz, and I'm very concise in the way I explain my over 12 years of experience working actually in the region. I put it this way: if they were fighting, I was there. So what I had was experience both during wartime and in post-war situations.
25 years, you said 15 years.
Well, it was actually more than a dozen years of actual time in the region.
Right.
And I worked in every permutation of the conflict. So every single conflict, including in Kosovo, the conflict between Serbs and Albanians, in Macedonia, between Macedonians and Albanians, in every theater in Bosnia, whether it involved Croats versus Muslims in Mostar, Serbs versus Bosniaks in Sarajevo, even the internal war of Fikret Abdic there in Bihać, as well as in Croatia, the struggle in Croatia between Croats and Serbs.
Right.
So that was my great privilege, was to witness on the ground every single permutation of the conflict and work in various capacities, including with the U.S. State Department, with OSCE, with NGOs, with the International Crisis Group, and gain
with the U.S. Army as well.
And with the U.S. Army, I was deployed for almost a year in Bosnia with IFOR in 1995, 1996. So a variety of organizations, but my great privilege, Janusz, was to work with and live with the people of the region, be they Albanian, Serb, Macedonian, or Croat. Or Bosniak. So this was truly a privilege to have worked so closely with the wonderful people of the Balkan region.
And you continue to obviously to follow developments. So I want to sort of start questioning you on how you see developments in the countries that we are most concerned with. So let us begin with Kosovo, which recently held parliamentary elections. How would you assess Kosovo's progress towards developing a state, a consolidated democracy? In other words, what has been accomplished, what still needs to be done?
Clearly, Kosovo has made major progress. And it's important to put that into context because we can remember the years of fruitless delay by the international community when it was known that it was inevitable. Kosovo's independence was going to be inevitable, and yet there were years of delay with the policy of standards before status, which needlessly created an opportunity for Russia to thwart Kosovo's independence and it create an opportunity which exists today to complicate the state building in the country.
Right.
So this is, I think, the foremost factor. Kosovo has made considerable progress. Of course, we know that the job is far from complete. And we see that there is still a political culture in the country that is far from mature. We see corruption and a role that corruption plays, for example, in the election results, in inclining voters to vote for a what I believe to be a problematic political party, Vetvendosia. And we know as well that Kosovo has institutional problems of developing itself, and this is critical because its independence is still disputed by members of the European Union itself, not just Serbia, not just Russia, but the fact that members of the EU itself do not recognize Kosovo's independence is in and of itself an obstacle to state building, as we see in neighboring Macedonia, a similar problem because of the opposition from Greece.
Let's stay with Kosovo for a moment. We'll switch to Macedonia in a second. How do you assess the major political forces? You mentioned you have problems with Vetvendosia. Could you elaborate on
Yes. We have a fundamental challenge in the Balkans, in the three countries that are those which still face open challenges there to their political form, and those are Kosovo, Macedonia, and Bosnia. And the critical challenge, not that there are not problems in the other country, but these are the three countries where we see the most acute problem, where there was conflict and where we see the violent conflict transformed into potentially an intense nonviolent conflict. And the challenge of our time in the Balkans, the primary one, is to close the open chapter. The only way to do that is to implement in the full spirit and letter the existing agreements. We have Kosovo. The Constitution was agreed to by Mati Ahtisaari. That is the guidepost. That is the Bible by which all parties have to accept, and it is the standard by which the country's progress is measured and the platform for the country to go forward to eventual NATO and EU membership. And a party like Vetvendosia, with its platform of joining Albania, which is its long-standing platform. Albin Kurti is not kidding, and it's not joking. It's not simply a political ploy. It's absolutely a dedication. This is directly inimical to the letter and spirit of the Ahtisaari Agreement. And not only that, of course, the dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina, Kurti opposes that. And these policies are highly complicated, and they are very troubling, and they will not advance Kosovo's future. So the fact that Vetvendosia got 30 seats in parliament, which is very impressive, and of course we know that part of it is the fight against corruption and the appeal on that. The fact that Shpend Ahmeti has been an effective mayor of Pristina, we know that. But its core position is one that is deeply problematic, and it's problematic for the United States as the country, the strongest single backer and supporter of Kosovo's independence. It's problematic for the United States.
So how do you see the PDK-AAK coalition and the ODK? In other words, the other party, the other major parties.
Well, this is the thing. The most immediate question, of course, is can the lead coalition, the PDK-led coalition with AAK, the one with Ramush at its lead, who would be the prime minister, it's whether they can form a government. The coalition has 39 seats.
Or whether the government will last after its full.
Exactly. Not only that, but first and foremost, the question is who can they attract to overcome the threshold that they need to form a government, and that's an open question. Now, clearly, President Daci will give Ramush the opportunity, the first chance to form a government. But what if he can't? What if he struggles? We've seen this in many other countries where they struggle. Now, there is a limit to the amount of time under the Constitution for which a government formation can take place. And at the moment, we don't know whether either Vetvendosia or LDK under Isa Mustafa would be inclined to join the lead coalition, or at what price. So we have a complicated government formation question there. Separately, we have a wider question as to the political direction of the country and the appeal and what the implications are that PDK, the PDK-led coalition, and Vetvendosia did so well. And what they stand for and what that means in terms of Kosovo's progress.
Do you see Kosovo as a member of all international institutions, including the United Nations, over the coming years? Can this be done during the next government's mandate?
I think the government has made tremendous progress in this regard. And I think it's really a testament to the intelligence and the perseverance of leaders, for example, like Enver Hoxha, who has worked tirelessly when he was in power as minister to gain Kosovo international recognition in a variety of forms, both bilaterally and in terms of international organizations. And this steady increase of recognitions is something critical to providing Kosovo with legitimacy. And especially now with Russia's increasing involvement in the region, the work that Enver and others have done in the government to gain international recognition and legitimacy for Kosovo has been absolutely critical. The fundamental problem, again, remains with the EU, not really Serbia and not Russia, because we know they're not going to recognize. It's really, truly, the tragedy here is the opposition for truly selfish and specious reasons why members of the European Union...
5 members non-recognized.
Yes, exactly, the non-recognizers. And this is really the what is critical. Now, that's at the external. At the internal level, there obviously it's critical for Kosovo to continue the reforms. One of the biggest steps forward, and Albin Kurti, of course, would never accept this, is that the 19 April agreement between Pristina and Belgrade, brokered by Cathy Ashton with great help behind the scenes from Washington. This, whether popular or not, this normalization agreement has been a significant step forward for Kosovo. Listen, Serbia, just as the world should recognize that the Republic of Kosovo is a fact, so Kosovars need to recognize that Serbia is a fact, and that Serbia will always be the larger neighbor, and that developing positive relations with Serbia is an essential factor in Kosovo's development.
When we talk about normalization, we usually mean bilateral relations. Both countries recognize each other. How close are we to that? Has Serbia actually taken steps towards normalization in that sense?
Well, the normalization that Cathy Ashton brokered does not require yet the formal recognition. What is critical here is that Belgrade and Brussels have a very clear understanding that in no way, shape, or form can Serbia join the EU until it recognizes Kosovo. In other words, there cannot be simply a side deal, something less than formal recognition. Right. And why is this so important? Because we've seen from experience that even where countries are recognized by all members, for example, Croatia, we saw the problems that Croatia had with Slovenia. Simply by virtue of Slovenia taking advantage of the fact that Croatia was not then a member of the EU, and we saw the pressures applied. We see the continuing pressures that Greece applies on Macedonia. Can anyone doubt that if Serbia entered the EU without recognized Kosovo, can anyone doubt that Serbia would never, in those circumstances, recognize Kosovo and make its entrance all the more complicated?
So you would support joint entry, both Kosovo and Serbia at the same time, to avoid this sort of mutual blockage?
Joint entry would be ideal. However, we have to be fair. Each country, every member of the European Union, has to adopt and fulfill the acquis and all the standards that are required. And if the fact is that Serbia is far advanced in front of Kosovo in terms of implementing the acquis, in terms of making the reforms necessary, it is not fair to Serbia to simply hold Serbia hostage. What's critical, though, is to insist that when Serbia is ready to join the European Union, that it does so recognizing the Republic of Kosovo. That is what is essential, even if it enters the European Union in advance.
Let us turn to Macedonia, Ed, where you've done quite a bit of work in the past and recently published a major article in Foreign Affairs. Can you give us a sort of brief synopsis of where Macedonia stands? Is it now making progress with this new coalition government? Are you optimistic?
Well, there's certainly a major step forward with the fact that finally there is a government in Kosovo, and that in Macedonia, excuse me, that there's a government, and that the former Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski, who has the cloud of one of the most serious scandals in the entire region over the past 20 years, truly one of the most serious scandals, was not able to prevent any longer, he, in connection with the country's president, President Ivanov, were not any longer able to prevent the formation of a government led by his opponent, Zoran Zaev of the SDSM. It's important to put the whole question of Macedonia in perspective because it's so relevant for Kosovo and for Bosnia and the region. The entire problem of the Gruevski autocratic leadership that led to this very serious crisis, which could erupt again, and there should be no doubt that the crisis can erupt again in Macedonia, is a function of the country having been left in limbo, unable to advance to NATO membership, for which it absolutely qualified and was even offered membership back in 2008, and it's the impediment as well towards joining the European Union. And we know the reason. It's not complicated. It's no secret. The reason for this obstacle is Greece. The Greek objection to the country's name is the sole and exclusive reason why the country did not advance to NATO as it should have in 2008 and towards the European Union. And it was that failure that allowed Nikola Gruevski and inclined Nikola Gruevski to do the backdoor Balkan nationalist ploy of backsliding on all democratic accomplishments and progress, of which Macedonia had made a lot, in order for him to consolidate his control and the control of the Vimro Dipomana party over power. And it was this growing power and this megalomania that ultimately led to Gruevski's downfall, which was only exposed in the wiretap scandal.
Do you think, with the Greek question, that the EU and other international organizations that are bailing out Greece should make the bailout and potential debt forgiveness contingent on Greece recognizing or allowing Macedonia, whatever name, to come into, particularly into NATO?
Janusz, that's an excellent question that you ask. The reality of the Greek embargo on Macedonia's progress over the name is that neither Washington nor Brussels nor any European capital, including Berlin, has ever really invested itself in trying to resolve the problem, has never tried to utilize the leverage that you very rightly point out that it has. In effect, the situation that Athens has been treated like this by the United States and all European capitals and the EU and Brussels. It's been treated like this. Greece is either seen as too powerful or too weak for the outside powers in Europe or the United States to act. Either Greece is too powerful and Macedonia is too weak, therefore it would be futile in their eyes to intervene, or the country is flat on its back and has a severe financial crisis, therefore it's too weak. In other words, Washington, Brussels, Berlin, and other European capitals, for them, they've never seen it as the right time to truly invest in getting this long-standing and very serious political and resolvable problem finally addressed.
Back to Macedonia, particularly the position of Albanians. One of the reasons for blocking the formation of this new government by President Ivanov was this notion that what they called the Tirana platform would be the thin end of a wedge to dividing Macedonia. What is your view on this? What is this platform? How will it be implemented?
Well, as we wrote in the article, our article in Foreign Affairs, entitled "Will Macedonia's Nationalists Ruin the Country?" In which we warn that simply because Zaev has managed to form a government, we warn that the crisis is not over. We address this very question in there. And the answer is that the Tirana platform was not an obstacle for Nikola Gruevski when he was trying to form a government. Right. When he was trying to form a government and trying to get Dewey to repeat as his partner, that was then not an issue. No one was worried about a thin wedge in that case. And Nikola Gruevski and Vimro would have been quite happy to have had Dewey or any other Albanian party, anything for Gruevski to regain power and thwart the investigation into alleged wrongdoing when he was prime minister. Right. So suddenly, when the Albanian parties spurned Nikola Gruevski, and when Zaev opened his negotiations with for Albanian parties to join his government, suddenly the Tirana platform was a major issue for Vimro, and this was among the reasons, the spark for the disgraceful attack on Parliament that took place, in which Zaev and other members of Parliament were beaten there without adequate police protection.
Right. Well, hopefully Macedonia can get back on track now. I gather negotiations with Greece have begun. Of course, Athens, as you said, is the obstacle here. There has to be, I think, more leverage, more pressure.
That's right. It was good to see that Zaev, in his recent meeting in Brussels, raised this at the highest level with Donald Tusk. He raised this with Hahn, and it was very important.
It's high on the agenda.
That Zaev tried to get attention on this issue.
We've had good news recently in the Balkans. Wherever there's some bad news, there's some good news. Montenegro, member of NATO, finally, and deservedly, I would say. How will this impact, would you say, on NATO's mission in the region? Who is potentially next for membership?
Well, first, as you correctly say, this is a very positive step forward, and it was very important that Montenegro have any open question closed. And the suggestion that it was somehow not ready to join NATO, and we have to remember that the Russians have allies in Montenegro, and that there was a very strong evidence of an attempted coup against Djukanovic there just in last fall. And so it's a reminder of us of the investment and the determination, the new determination of Moscow to try to subvert the Western orientation of the countries of the region. And so you are so right, Janusz, that Montenegro's ascendance to NATO was absolutely critical. Now, it would be wonderful if any of the remaining countries that are non-NATO members, Bosnia, Serbia, or Kosovo, would join NATO. In fact, of the three, the one that is most critical, if it were to join NATO, would be Bosnia. Why? Because Kosovo, we know the Albanian-led government and the Albanian population is already oriented towards the West. There's no question about that. There are concerns, and we have to note them, about attraction to extremism. And we should be very open about that.
I was going to ask you about the formation of a military, but let's go to that.
Formation of the military, and we should also be aware that the attraction of ISIS it's true, and there's no reason to deny it. That there are factors in Kosovo. There is an appeal among some faction of religious Albanians in Kosovo, an attraction there, so which is antithetical, of course, to NATO and the United States. But the vast majority of Albanians, of course, are very positively oriented to the United States, to NATO, to Europe, and to the West. Bosnia and Serbia, of course, it's a different story. In both countries, we know that Russia has a very strong inroads into the country, and that the appeal of a supposed alternative path towards Moscow for some enters into political discourse. Of course, this is most obvious in the case in Bosnia with Milorad Dodik and his relationship with Moscow. But we also see this...
The president of Republika Srpska.
The president of Republika Srpska. We also see this in Serbia with Nikolic and others who have, and other politicians who praise Moscow. We've seen this with both the military and the political relationship. We see this in the statements of the Russian ambassador in Belgrade. And we know that since the crisis in Ukraine, that what was once a very detached perspective towards the Balkans has now changed to one of competition and an interest in Moscow in trying to subvert, where possible, the Western integration of the countries of the region.
Going back to NATO for a second, and I want to touch on Russia. Military structure in Kosovo, I mean, should they push ahead, and how should this be done? Because in order to qualify for NATO, you need a military. You need to be able to control your borders.
This, in my view, the movement towards having an army that is NATO compatible, which is an understandable and a laudable goal, should be done in concert with the discussions with Belgrade on the implementation of the normalization and advancement of the normalization. In other words, there should not be a Albin Kurti, Vetvendosia type policy, of a radical policy, where Kosovo would somehow develop an army, even though it would be eventually, in his view, joining Albania, and at the same time not having any progress in its discussions with Serbia. In my view, the two should proceed in parallel, in a responsible way, that because it's important. We have to remember that there is a Serb minority in Kosovo, and we have to remember there's a Serb that some that live south of the Ibar, some who live north of the Ibar, and particularly those who live south of the Ibar have legitimate concerns, legitimate vulnerabilities, and we should not look at the question of a Kosovo army simply in isolation outside of Kosovo's overall institutional progress and its development of its relationship with the Serbs both in the south and the north of the country.
And it could be argued, for example, we're opposed to Republika Srpska blocking Bosnia's progress towards NATO and the EU, and the Russian infiltration and involvement in that mix. Couldn't the same be said about the Serb government, through the Serb minority in Kosovo, blocking Kosovo's path towards European Union and NATO?
it's an excellent question, and this is, again, the reason why the policy and the position of hardliners in Pristina is such a mistake. If it's one thing, if Pristina proceeds in goodwill towards reaching out, implementing its obligations under agreements, both under the Constitution and agreements, the normalizations agreements, and that it then is thwarted by both Serbs in the north and by Belgrade. That's one thing. If Pristina acts in goodwill and the Serbs, whether in the north or Belgrade, thwart it. Of course, in that case, why should Kosovo be penalized? It's another thing to act irresponsibly and to say, we don't, if we don't live up to our end, so what? We're going to press on. We have our view. We have our right. And we're going to press on regardless of our own accountability to the obligations that we've made. Right. And regardless of what the U.S. Embassy or others encourages us to do, we have the right no matter what. That is, in my view, that is the typical Balkan prescription, and that will lead to a conflict that I believe is not in Kosovo's interest.
But presumably for the Kosovo government, new government coming in now, it will be important to work with the Pentagon, with our Department of Defense on this question. In other words, creation, as you said, of a NATO-compatible security structure, military in Kosovo. Would you agree?
Well, it will be important, absolutely, to have a good, positive communication with the Pentagon. Just as, if I could say this ironically, Belgrade has had. Exactly. And Belgrade's Ministry of Defense has had positive, regardless of its position on NATO. The relationship between Belgrade's Ministry of Defense and the Pentagon has actually been quite positive. And that's all to the good. And so cultivation of a positive relationship. But I am sure what the senior officials and the generals in the Pentagon are going to be telling their counterparts in Pristina. They're going to also say, make sure that you hold up your end of your bargains with the Serbs. Yes, we know that you have concerns and we know that you have complaints. Make sure, this is what the generals will tell, and this is what the Pentagon officials will tell their counterparts. Make sure you live up to your obligations. Make sure that you do the utmost so that Serbs in the south feel secure, and that you have your hand outreached to those Serbs in the north who are willing to discuss and to cooperate. And I'm sure that that's going to be a critical part of the dialogue.
And as you mentioned, Russia continues to try and subvert this process to maintain weak states, divided states, states that do not integrate into either NATO or the EU. How do we counter this Russian offensive, which you could say, except in Montenegro, you could say is a soft power offensive, Russia's version of soft power, propaganda, corruption, energy, business, and so forth?
I think it's a very important question, and I think there's two elements for it. There's the element of what outsiders, including the United States and Europe, can do, and then there's the element of what the leaders and the people of the region can do. With respect to outsiders, the time for passivity in Washington of thinking that it's a European problem, we just need to take a back seat and let Brussels and Berlin deal with the issues in Bosnia, Macedonia, and Kosovo. That is clearly finished. We know the situation is far too serious about that, and we've seen encouraging indications from senior State Department officials of recognition of this. For example, in Macedonia, it is the United States State Department. We know that Hoyi played a critical role going to Skopje and in sending the signal that a progress had to be made on forming a new government. So there are encouraging signs in Washington that this policy of passivity, of simply taking a backseat to Europe, is over. Likewise in Europe, the focus, for example, simply on social and economic program, that approach in Bosnia is completely inadequate. and same in other countries, Berlin and Brussels have to be politically engaged and cannot simply cede the field to Russia by saying, oh, you could just do some social and economic reforms, and we don't need to do anything on the constitution in Bosnia, or these difficult political questions, whether in Kosovo with our non-recognizers or in Macedonia. That is finished. Then finally, Janusz, the leaders of the region have an obligation. And this is why I say radical agendas, radical ones, and let's use the term, Greater Albania agendas. These are music to the ears of Russia.
Or a Greater Serbia agenda.
Or absolutely. Greater Serbia, greater anything. Greater Albania, Greater Serbia. This is only plays into the hands of Moscow. This only plays into the hands of those Serbs, whether within Kosovo or in Serbia themselves, who want to undermine Kosovo's progress and undermine it. So again, I say these radical agendas, what Vetvendosia pursues, radical agendas to the extent that elements of the PDK coalition subscribe to them, these are a mistake, and they are not in the interests of Kosovo.
Turning now, last part of our talk, to the Donald Trump administration. You haven't mentioned very much up till now. How do you assess the administration so far in terms of foreign policy? There seems to be some disconnect between what is I think a fairly good national security team and some of the statements coming out of the White House, particularly from Donald Trump himself. Do you see a disconnect? Do you see a direction in foreign policy?
It is a disconnect, Janusz, in Washington with a capital D. It is absolute confusion here, because we have a president who is both irresponsible and impulsive, and who uses Twitter to communicate directly with his core supporters, and which in some cases completely contradicts the efforts of his State Department and his Department of Defense.
Sometimes during the same day.
Absolutely, including even the same day. We have the best example right now is the crisis over Qatar in the Middle East, where we have Secretary of State Tillerson trying to calm the situation, and we have tweets from President Trump aligning himself clearly with in support of Saudi Arabia. And in continuing criticism of Qatar. So we see the confusion there. With respect to the Balkans, obviously the main point here, and this has been true for some time, is that the Balkans are not a primary preoccupation of the administration, and nor were they under President Obama. And in fact, we have to go back really to 2008, to Kosovo's independence, when President Bush was in power, 2006. There in that 2006-2008 period, when you saw truly concerted senior attention. The situation in Ukraine has renewed interest. The fact that it is known in Washington that Russia has renewed interest. But we have additional complications because of the Russia scandal in Washington, which even Janusz, as we speak today, not only really perhaps less than a kilometer from us, we have more
congressional sessions,
more dramatic testimony concerning this, and so we have a very complicated situation where a cloud of suspicion hangs over the Trump administration about its relationship with Russia, and we have a Russia that is determined to subvert the West in the Balkans.
On the other hand, we have a very strong Secretary of Defense, very committed to NATO, very committed to rebuilding the U.S. military, very committed to transatlanticism. Do you see his role as being more prominent in the future?
I think it is quite possible that Secretary Mattis, who is, as the expression goes, the adult, one of the adults in the room, who may play a more prominent role, along with the National Security Advisor General McMaster. The two of them have proven themselves. The one thing that was critical was the strike on Syria that went very well. This enhanced the legitimacy of both McMaster and Mattis, and to some degree marginalized Steve Bannon, who is a very dangerous and odious figure in the White House and who opposed that strike. That strike was...
He's from the populist right
wing, and the very bigoted part of also these anti-Muslim immigration executive orders. And it was very important that that strike went well. It proved that, contrary to what President Obama had thought, that you could, in fact, strike directly at President Assad without getting embroiled in another Middle East conflict. It proved that, in fact, that that was not true, that you could send a very important signal, and militarily, not just politically.
So as a last question, Ed, do you envisage any initiatives in the Balkans by this administration, by the Trump administration?
Well, what I think is it's possible if officials are left to their own devices. There are very capable officials there, Hoi Yi, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, there, who are capable and committed, and if left to pursue initiatives and not blocked, you could have initiatives. Will someone at the level of Secretary Tillerson take an engagement in the region? I think a lot of that, I think it's not outside the possibility, but it depends. We should remember, first and foremost, on one word, a perception of one name, and that's Russia. If there is a perception that Russia is truly playing a dangerous and subversive role, and at the same time recognition of the cloud of suspicion over the administration, then what better way to counteract that by standing up to Russian provocations and Russian subversion in the Balkans? It's a theater. It's a very safe theater. It's unlike Ukraine. It doesn't risk military confrontation between Moscow and Washington. It's a much safe. We have excellent allies in the countries of the region. We have a very strong reputation. We have a much less conflicted European Union compared to Ukraine, which Ukraine doesn't really have the same kind of relationship with the EU that the countries of the region have. For example, Croatia is a full-fledged EU member. So we have the potential for a much safer and effective counteraction to Russian policy in the Balkans, which is actually a very good reason for Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Mattis, General McMaster to try and focus on the region.
On that positive note, Ed, I think we'll close. Thank you very much for being with us, and I hope you maintain your engagement in the region, because it's still important to have analysts and activists like you to be in the region to help it over the next few steps.
Thank you very much, Janusz, and I can only say the same to you. Your engagement in the region has been and remains critical.
Thanks so much, Ed. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues here at RTK and VOA. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshim.